I have assisted in training more than a generation of PhDs. And yet in formal education, I finished the lower part of the 7th grade. I meant my life to be some kind of a statement. I meant my life to say something. How then can a poor son of sharecroppers from Union Springs, Alabama, educate himself, give himself a high school education and a college education, and finally go to college under the GI Bill of Rights and get so bored with the teachers because he had read more than they read and got kicked out of college for contradicting the teachers because they were poor teachers of white history because he didn't expect them to teach black history at all. The point of my life is that with or without the college, I'm not advising anyone to stay out of college. Go every time the door opens if you got the fee. But I didn't have the fee. So I went to secondhand bookstores in New York where the kids sell their books after they finish. And so I got the 8th grade book, the 9th grade book, the 10th grade books. And not only studied, I gave myself an examination in each one. Then I started giving myself courses in literature. There's some things to be said about the subject that's not personal, that is broad and historical. On the face of this earth, as we look toward the 21st century, we might number 1 billion people on the face of this earth. Why is it that 1 billion people don't have the power of 1 billion people? Why is it that 1 billion people have not built an educational system and an economic system based on their numbers in the world? And we're the most strategically placed people in the world. We're scattered everywhere. Why haven't we hooked up a network of African people from the Pacific, Asia, all over Africa, the Caribbean islands, all over South America? What separated us and what separated our mind from a belief in ourselves and a belief in the concept of nationhood? I will do what I was advised to do years ago. Doing chores in a high school in Columbus, Georgia. I was holding the books of a recitalist. He was on stage because the high school, one of the Rosenwald high schools, the high school was so new, we didn't even have a curtain. He was performing to raise some money for the curtain. And he had a book that I was holding along with his coat. The book was called The New Negro. I opened to an essay called The Negro Digs Up His Past. By Arthur Schomburg, a Puerto Rican of African descent. I learned for the first time that I came from a people that was old, older than Europe, older than our oppressor. I began to walk around with this air of smugness. We had a civilization before these people had shoes or lived in a house that had a window. They just got here day before yesterday. I never enjoyed the unluxury of having an inferiority complex. I'm breaking up the language so you can understand what I'm talking about. But years ago, working in homes in the South, I worked for whites who had good libraries, but they never seemed to use these libraries. And when I took the books home, they never seemed to miss them. So I stopped bringing them back. So I would forge the name of a well-known white person's name on a note and go to the public library where blacks were not allowed to give this boy certain books. And I would get the books until one day the person whose name I forged appeared in the library at the same time. I don't know what he was doing there. I never seen him read a newspaper, let alone a book. So that ended my bootleg book borrowing. But my main point is that though growing up poor, unlighted streets, with a father who made $18 one week and lectured to his family, if you persevere and if you're honest, you'll make it in this country. Look what I have done. $18 in 1 week. And I listened to his lesson until years later in the army. I took a shiner to some lady and gave a birthday party for her at a nightclub in San Antonio, Texas, and tipped the head waiter $50. Then I had to deal with my father's contradictions. I had to deal with my own contradictions. Before coming to the personal side of this whole thing, let's look at the historical side of it. We're talking about the infusion of African-American history and African history into world history and into American history. How then did we get lost from the respect for commentary of human history? We have to look at Europe, then look at Africa. I won't go back to Nile Valley civilization. That's been well covered. I want to look at that last 1,000 years of independence in West Africa before the slave trade. We have not made a serious study of what we did when the state was in our hands. We have not looked at our own humanity and how is it that on this continent we would create clusters of enduring civilizations, create religions, bring into being the concepts of the matrilineal and the patrilineal, create a system where if you had a god, you had to have a goddess, therefore giving females equality. That man was nothing unless he had the counterpart that was woman. That man, if man is not part woman, he's nothing. He's not man. And we did not argue about whether a man was superior to a woman. You don't even argue about whether he's superior to your mother. It's a stupid argument. We never entered that argument. And if you remember Roots, that first chapter when the boy comes home from the ceremonial manhood, and Hollywood messed up the scene so terribly. When he turned to his grandmother, played by Maya Angelou, and said, men don't let women tell him what to do. That was absolute disaster. In true African culture, at the ceremonial manhood, that young man comes and prostrates himself at the door of his mother. And he will not rise until she touches him on the shoulder and said, rise, precious fruit of my womb, and accept my blessing. He is not a man until she says so. The woman that gave him life declares he's a man. And he cannot be a man until she decides that he is one. The father's role at this point is to invite the neighborhood in for the banquet following his christening of manhood. We have forgotten so many good customs we had. Custom that was old before Europe was born. We have forgotten that half of human history was over before anybody knew that there was anything in the world called a European. Now, in the 15th and the 16th century, when Europe came out of the lethargy of the Middle Ages, when they learned latitude and longitude again, when they learned maritime skill taken from Spain, preserved by the Africans and the Arabs at the University of Salamanca, the Europeans took this skill and turned on the preservers and began to enslave the Africans on the Mediterranean. This accounts for the large number of technically trained Africans in the New World before the formal beginning of slavery. It accounts for Alonzo Nino, pilot on Christopher Columbus' ship. It accounts for the wheat farmer with Cortez. It accounts for the African armorer with Pizarro in Peru. It accounts for the African road builders with Magellan and Balboa. It accounts for the Africans who built a road across the Isthmus of Darien, now the Isthmus of Panama. Have we studied the skillful African craftsmen in the New World before the formal beginning of chattel slavery? If you want subjects for PhDs, there's 1,000 subjects untreated. And if you pay some attention to it, you can do it better than others because you have a feeling for it, or should have a feeling for it better than others. Now, let us look briefly at the period in history that requires a lot of study, because this is the period when you were lost from the respectful commentary of history. 1400 to 1600. Europe comes out of the lethargy of the Middle Ages. It comes out of the Middle Ages, people poor, land poor, resource poor. It's lost 1/3 of its population through famines and plagues. It's looking for routes to the east. It's looking for spices, looking for sweets, looking for something to put on that gosh darn awful European food so they could eat it. En route, they discover Africa, quite by accident. We have to look at some neglected dates in history that brought about this loss. 1415, the Portuguese attacked a small enclave in Morocco called Ceuta. I've gone to Ceuta. It's less than the size of Central Park in New York City. Not much of an achievement to conquer it. But in 1455, there's an argument between the Africans and the Arabs. The Arabs are marrying more than the customary 4 women and letting them stay in the Catholic Church. The African who is a Puritan, he's marrying the Spanish woman, but she has to keep a Muslim diet if he's a Muslim. Failing that, he goes home to get his wife. We are the true believers. We take religion seriously. We think it means what it says. We out Muhammad, we out Pope the Pope. Because we are serious about what we get into. And other people get into it as a utility. Now, the corruption of the Arabs, along with the women, they're loosening their hold on Spain. Half of Spain pulls away. that Castilian part. Half of Spain is partly free of African Arab domination. They now go to the Pope. They go to the Pope to settle disputes over demarcation. A colonial people now with colonial aspiration. And what does the Pope say? You two good Catholic nations, stop fighting among yourselves. You are both authorized to reduce to servitude all infidel people. And all Europe needed to reduce you to servitude is said that you're an infidel. So open war on the non-Christian, the enslavement of the non-Christian became a way of life. It's a pity that people don't read a book that some people think is obsolete, but it's not obsolete at all. All that I'm saying is in the first 3 chapters of Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery. It's extended in another, in his last book, The Caribbeans from Columbus to Castro. People keep calling for things that had already been done and done well. You didn't read other black writers when they wrote these books and wrote them well. Why are you calling for new books? You haven't read the old ones. Europe is underway. Now look at the years now between the former starting of the slave trade, the 1440s and 1492. But go back and look at another neglected date in history, 1482. This is the year a Portuguese expedition came around the coast of Ghana and forced their way in. Because the Africans wouldn't buy the Bible story, they had to buy the gun story. Now these Europeans wanted permanent settlements. They were dressed well. They said they were sent by God who makes day and night. The white man was then palming himself off as a god. He would begin something that's still intact. Not only the colonization of history, but the colonization of information about history. And then the greatest master stroke that's still intact, the colonization of the image of God. No people will ever be free so long as their God concept was assigned to them by another people. If you study the history of modern Japan and how could they come back after being defeated, after 2 atomic bombs fell on them? America took away a lot of things from them. There are 2 things they refused to let America take away. Their belief in themselves and their concept of God as they conceived him to be. I have said that a cultural revolution is needed in Africa, and that cultural revolution will not start until an African head of state prays to an African God in public without apologies. What proof do you have that Christ was white? None whatsoever. What proof do you have that the ancient Jews were white? None whatsoever. What proof do you have that the modern European calling himself a Jew relates to the ancient Jews? None whatsoever. You accept it because they told you, and you have not questioned it. You have not done your research. Now, the European needed a rationale for what he was about to do. And if you study the children, study the crusade, but study the children's crusade. Over 500,000 kids marched across Europe, half of them froze to death. When they got to the warm waters of the Mediterranean, they sold the other half to the infidel Arab that they were fighting. Had we studied the European mentality, had we known that this is the kind of people we were dealing with, we wouldn't have been slaves because we would have killed them on sight. We could have saved ourselves. We thought he had the same humanity as we had. So when we saw him, we invited him for dinner. We didn't know that we had never dealt with people who would come in your house, eat your food, rape your wife, and enslave the host. Our mind was not geared to deal with such a people. In West Africa, our mind was not geared to deal with that Arab slave trader in East Africa. And we still are not too clear about who is our friend and who's our foe. And if you want to be clear about who are your friends, find a mirror and don't move from that mirror until you like what's staring back at you. All right, now, what is my personal journey in learning this subject? Growing up, partly in Georgia, partly in Alabama, after the death of my mother, we would go back, the children would be sent back to Alabama, where my great-grandmother still presiding over the family. She was a cultist Baptist and had pity for Methodists. There's one thing she thought was hopeless, was a Methodist. These people who sprinkle. She said that judgment day will come and a bunch of dirty Methodists going to bunch up at the Golden Gate, and the good Lord going to say, go back and take a bath, be immersed in the water. Because I worshiped her, she presented me with a contradiction, took me years to work out of. She said the Bible was God's word, not to be contradicted, not even the curse, and that we had sinned somewhere along the line, and the Lord will lift the veil from our eyes one of these days and forgive us for whatever sin we did. And I couldn't remember or understand what sin we had done. We were more sinned against. And yet I love her to this day. She's a deity. And she was always telling me stories about her husband Buck that was sold to a slave breeding farm in Virginia. That was the father of my grandfather. And every time any members of the family would gather, she would tell this story. I didn't know what my mind was being trained to be, but the fascination with this old lady and her love for me and never letting anyone punish me when I did something bad, she said, send the boy to me. And she would grab the switch or strap and she started hitting, and our sweat was hugging, and it felt nice. Then I would go on the journey and help her round up the turkeys because she had the turkey concession. She would continue to tell me stories. She was a slave in Georgia during the Civil War, and she saw Sherman march to the sea, and she swore on this. I got close enough to him to see his eyes redder than a coon, she said. Meanest man I ever saw. We contradicted her, said, Mom, Mary, you couldn't possibly see in his eyes. And she would stand up and tap her walking stick on the floor. Say, I see it. I see it. That's the end of that. No further conversation. She was a deity, and we did not contradict deities. She said she saw Sherman march to the sea, and eyes redder than the coon. That's the way it was. She's one of the 3 women that has shaped my life, infused some tenderness in my personality as a human being. My great-grandmother, my mother, and my 5th grade teacher who taught me to believe in myself and who said that I will never let you be less than your best self. And through the years, every time I try to get into a little devilishment or pull a deal, I see one of those 3 women somewhere. And all have been dead over 50 years, and yet they appear somewhere in my consciousness or somewhere in my vision. And I straighten up. They wouldn't like this one. My main point here is that I had to deal with this Bible that she said was the truth. I learned how to read very early because I wanted to teach the junior class in Sunday school. And in Columbus, Georgia, when I saw the illustrated Bible in the Sunday school lessons, everybody was white. It was just those angels that gave me so many problems. All the brown people are dead. All the black people are dead. Not one sneaked into heaven. Not a single brown angel. Not a single black angel. I see Moses, born in Africa. Moses white. Yeah. Goes down to marry Zipporah, an Ethiopian. Zipporah gets white. I see people going to the land of Punt or Punnat, present-day Somali. They got white. People going to Kush, present-day Sudan, and they got white. What has happened? You mean to tell me this is God's holy work and we left out of all of it? And you tell me God is love and left us out of the book? Couldn't quite deal with it. This was years before I began to read biblical literature. Years before I read Sir James Frazier's Folklore of the Old Testament. So when I came to New York, finally joining the old Harlem History Club, finding Arthur Schomburg, who told me I wanted to know the history of my people henceforth right then within the hour, his lunch hour. All of it. He said, patiently, sit down, son. What you call in Negro history and African history, the missing pages of world history. He said, son, go study the history of your masters. Go study the history of Europe. And I did. And once I came back to the history of Africa, having studied the history of Europe, I knew how these contradictions were set in motion. I began by reading an old chestnut, still worth reading in spite of all the racism in it. H.G. Wells, An Outline of History. Then I began with the heavier thing. Europeans contradicting Europeans, Spingar's The Decline of the West. I began systematically to give myself a college education. And in the history club, Willis N. Huggins, its teacher, and his fine protege, John Jackson, still alive in Chicago. I've attended his 79th birthday 3 times. So he's 79. He's 79 and holding. So I'm 70 and holding. Now, John Jackson had already written a little pamphlet, The African origins of the legend of the Garden of Eden. That this was an old story retold by Jewish folklores. And was Jesus Christ a Negro? It also written a pamphlet called Pagan Origins of the Christ Myth. Not debunking Christ, but showing that every civilization in the world has its Christ story, and you only know one. And you think it's the story. My point is that every people on the earth have a God concept based on their understanding of their culture. You have a God concept real to you by another people, and you were killed over it, and it wasn't yours in the first place, except it was remade from something taken from you and rehashed. It's a carbon copy religion. Go back to the original. I didn't say lose your religion. Go back to your original copy, other than practicing someone else's carbon copy. Go back to spirituality. Before someone spoils spirituality with a concoction called religions, that they turn into murder cults. Now, if you say that this man is godless, you're dead wrong. I've got as much God as anybody in this room. And I believe as much as anybody in this room. I just believe in it in a different way. When I know that I cannot make a rose, I cannot make a tree, I cannot make the ocean roar, I cannot cure a stomach ache, I know that there's a force in the universe far more powerful than I will ever be. And I remember in my poetry writing days, I wrote a little poem that I remembered again after the storm and the hurricane. And it went, I will tell you what nature says as she whispers in my ear each day. It's woven in each song she sings. Man compared with me is an insignificant thing. I know there is a God equivalent. I just acknowledge him in a different way. Now, in the History Club, John Jackson had already written the forerunner of his book, Christianity Before Christ. With Willis and Huggins, he had written Introduction to African Civilization and a Guide to the Study of African History. During the Italian-Ethiopian War, Willis and Huggins was sent to Geneva to look into the affairs and report back to us. While Huggins was away, the Young Turks took over the History Club. John Jackson delivered the first lecture, The Black Man as an Imperialist, When Blacks Ruled Whites. What did we do and how did we conduct ourselves when we were ruling other people's country? We never annihilated any people to the last man, woman, and child as had been done to some of us. We had humanity even in conquest. I delivered the second lecture. It's called An Inquiry into the Racial Identity of Jesus Christ. They didn't have tape recorders during that period, but I continued to study the world's religions and their formations. But from this lecture and from my study, I wrote a short story. I wanted to know if people in Columbus, Georgia knew that I'd moved up north and I'd become a somebody. Writing poetry, short stories. This story is still the most reprinted short story written by an African-American writer. It is called The Boy Who Painted Christ Black. I wrote it over 50 years ago. I was 23. It's my most famous story, and yet it is not my best story. I wrote a better story about growing up in Georgia that a lot of people have overlooked because it's a good literary story. And that one is called Santa Claus Was a White Man. I began to remember Miss Evelina Taylor, who called me to her room one day. I remember the time when Thomas Edison died. And she was telling us how Thomas Edison invented this and invented that. And she kept looking around to make sure the principal wasn't coming. And she locked the door and leaned over and told us the story of Louis Latimer, who really invented the... Edison developed the principle for the light. Louis Latimer developed that filament that makes it burn indefinitely. And he created the first textbook on the incandescent light we now call the fluorescent light. She was sneak a black character into that, sneak one in all kinds of history. And there was a king from Siam came to America with some cataracts named King Parchatapat. And then she held up the picture of King Parchatapat, once more looking to see if the principal was coming. Said, "Looks like one of us, don't it?" She taught you to read well and to think well. And as a matter of pride, you did not leave her room without knowing both of them. So now, in the early 30s, in the Harlem community, in the midst of oppression, of the Depression, I began to understand something about the lack of history in the text, because I knew now that you have to take a people out of history if you're going to rationalize their oppression, that you cannot easily oppress a consciously historical people. If you want to oppress a people, you got to make them ahistorical. You got to remove them from history. You got to make them believe that they do not deserve to be in history. And once they are in that trap, they cease to be a danger, because they will forget one of their great achievements in history, that on the continent of Africa for thousands of years, they built enduring civilizations without a jail system, without one psychiatrist, without old people's home, because no one threw away grandma and grandpa. We must study the impact of foreigners on Africa. We must stop all this lie about Islam being the black man's true religion, and study the infusion of the Arabs, who also, like all invaders, did Africa more harm than good. And we must clearly distinguish between Islam and Arabism, something most blacks cannot do. And most blacks cannot deal, have not done, black Muslims have not dealt with the destructive force of Islam, and to what extent the independent states of Africa was destroyed by Muslims. And this is the reckoning ruin the Europeans found when they got there. Islam and the Arabs drained Africa of so much energy and organization. It had no energy and organization to resist the Europeans. I'm not saying one thug is better than the other thug. I'm just saying one thug came before the other thug. And each one brought a religion that they betray. The Arabs don't practice Islam, the Europeans don't practice Christianity. There are two things you can set your clock by. That the European will never practice democracy or Christianity. Not even 24 hours. You can take bets on that. Because if he did, he's finished. Said, thou shalt not steal. He stole you. What's going to happen if he return you? Thou shalt not kill. He maintained your land by protracted murder. Suppose he's going back and get the real origin of the 10th Commandments, which is African in origin, existed thousands of years before the Hebrew entry. Let me see if I can conclude something that has no conclusion. What impact did we have on the Americas, the Caribbean islands, and in the United States? At what point do we go over the chronology of Africa and realize that when Europe was having its dark ages, Africa didn't have any dark age? What makes you think that this dark age was all over the world? When Europe was having its dark age, Africa was having, West Africa having an age of enlightenment, bringing into being great independent states. Ghana, Mali, Songhai, in East Africa, great states, the Zimbabwe states, the coastal Zulu states before they migrated to the south. All of these are independent states. And after these states fell, the Yoruba states, the Kan states, many independent African states survived the slave trade and lived in spite of the slave trade. Let's place African history side by side with world history and infuse African history into world history. I'm not saying take white people out of history. I'm saying put the African in his proper place. Let them stay, along with our phonies. Let's tell the real truth about Christopher Columbus. A liar, a fraud who discovered absolutely nothing. A welch on his debts. Our labor saved this new world. Our labor saved the economy of Europe. Other people are getting reformations and all kind of compensation. They owe you so much, you shouldn't put a figure on it. Give me the key to your treasure. I'll take the money and I'll leave you the change. Take the rest. Then, how do you infuse African American history into American history? Let's take the first half of that 19th century. The rise of Douglass and the black radical movements. The rise of independent black institutions in New England. The rise of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. They're saying something. The rise of the black Masons that Prince Hall called the African Lodge. We weren't afraid of the word African. The whole colonizational concept, the settlement of Liberia. Let's deal with what we went wrong in the settlement of Liberia. We went to Liberia saying we're going to civilize our heathen brothers. We misread him and misread Christianity. Liberia, one of the sickest nations in Africa. Civilize our heathen brothers. He had more civilization than we had. We had the farm, but we didn't have the substance. We still have the farm. Then we come to the American Revolution. I didn't say take Washington out of the American Revolution. Let's put blacks in the proper place. Let's tell the real story of Christopher Adams. But there are black heroes other than Christopher Adams who really were more heroic. Let's dig up, do some research on Deborah Gannon. Whites are forever trying to prove that she was white. She served in the regiment, disguised as a man. They discharged her after 9 months and gave her a certificate of virtue. That's the worst thing they could have done. Nobody questioned her virtue until they gave her that damn certificate. Let's deal with the meaningful black women after the American Revolution. Let's deal with the early writers. Let's deal with our literary expression. Let's deal with that first half of the revolution. When we're talking about radicals, there should be a place for Martin Delany. There should be a place for Robert Campbell, who went with Martin Delany and searched for a place for settlement in a place called Abeokuta in Nigeria, present-day Nigeria. There should be a place where we signal out those brilliant Caribbean activists like Hall, Ruswan, and Campbell. They didn't call themselves Caribbean or West Indians. They knew what some people don't seem to know right now, that we all left Africa on the same slave ship. They dropped some off in the West Indies and come on and drop some off over here. We're not separate people. You served under one a slave master had one accent. I served on a slave master had another accent. But if the ultimate punishment for not doing your work was death in the West Indies and death over here, I don't want to hear no argument about whether slavery in the West Indies was milder than slavery in the United States. If you got killed in both places, if the ultimate punishment in both places was death, then you got no argument about which is better. The role of the West Indies in revolts, the most successful revolts, because they could keep some of the culture continuity together, hadn't been told. But the Caribbean islands is the logical preface to African American history. When you teach African American history and leave out the Caribbean islands, you're leaving out the preface. Because to thoroughly understand it, you have to understand that there were nation formations and revolts in the Caribbean islands 100 years before the first blacks landed at Jamestown, Virginia. So it was a different kind of experience and a different kind of revolt because they were the majority. That Jamaica revolted more than Haiti. It did not become independent. Let's make a comparative study between one and the other. In between revolts in Jamaica, they broke they broke the momentum. They killed the incentive. You have to build the incentive all over again. But in the Haitian revolt, the major revolts took place over a 20-year period. So the spirit of the revolt could not be broken before they sent up another leader to continue. It was a fortunate incident in history. It had nothing to do who was braver. And the fact that nearly all the slave revolts in the Caribbean were engineered by house servants, and nearly all the slave revolts in the United States were betrayed by house servants, does not prove that the black American is less brave than the Caribbean American. Because in America, they bought in small lots and broke them up often. In the Caribbean islands in South America, they bought in large lots. So therefore, they could keep their African culture continuity together. They could keep some of their families partnered together. They could keep something else together, a loyalty system. Therefore, the slave in the house related to the slave in the field. While in this country, the slave in the house was a stranger to to the slave in the field and felt threatened by the slave in the field. When are we going to get it straight and stop boasting about sheer nonsense among us? When are we going to stop talking about culture? And if you're not talking about African culture, you're not talking about anything anyway. In coming to the United States in 1619, let's look at that first family. Let's look at the fact that they were indentures and not slaves, and they worked their way out of it. And one became not only a landowner, but one, Anthony Johnson, became a slave owner. I'm not proud of him, but as a matter of fact, he did. Let's look at the fact that there were white indentured servants in the country, more white indentured servants than blacks, when the blacks arrived. Let's look at the fact that some of these whites married blacks, and some of these white women got out of indentured servitude ahead of time and bought their black lover out of indenture. That's the origin of Benjamin Banneker, one of these relationships. But not only let it all hang out, but let us examine it all. There'll be enough embarrassment to go around. Let us look at our contribution to the American Revolution, especially James Fortin, who made the tents for Washington's army. Then Washington realized that that tent cloth was better than the cloth in the breeches of his soldiers. And James Fortin began to make breeches from that matted tent cloth. And these breeches that saved Washington's army that second, third, and fourth winter. Blacks played a major role in the American Revolution. When I'm saying that to put blacks in the American Revolution, you don't have to take whites out of the revolution. Let Paul Revere make his ride. Although J.A. Rogers had dug up some information that tend to indicate that Paul Revere had a second reason for making the ride. The first reason was to warn the people, of course. And the second reason, because he was in the bootleg business, to warn his other fellow bootleggers to hide the stuff before the British come and put tax on it. Both reasons were legitimate. He was a businessman. Now let's deal with some of the lies told in the American Revolution. Some of the lies about Washington, about the cherry tree. It was a lie that was written by somebody Washington didn't even know. And he liked the lie, and he didn't accept it. It did good for his ego. Sometimes a lie works on the ego in such a way that you begin to believe it is true. I can remember, because of my quiet conduct and threading needles for old ladies and running errands, I would pass on the street and I would hear the old lady on the porch speak of me in my family name, Bubba. That's little Bubba Clarke. That boy got a head on his shoulder. He gonna grow up. He gonna be a leader of some kind. That boy gonna be something in this world. You know, my little ego like that, and I felt called off. I got to grow up and be something. And when I left home, I lived in a boarding house that became another kind of house. In a rival house next door, run by a fine character named Sally Chickenfoot, who couldn't read. I would read her receipts for her, and she wouldn't give anybody the 10 cents a week for her policy until I came and made sure everything was written out all right. And once I certified it was correct, she gave the man the dime. I was her little hero. I come and read the papers to her. And I can remember when I was leaving home and she said something. I still remember it, and it still encourages me. I'm not going to use her words. She said, in essence, in effect, there goes a black man that will someday be something the rest of us black folks are going to one day feel proud of. And you know how she said all of this is part of the things which nourished me personally, made me learn history and to be a better teacher, a better human being, as decent a father as I knew how to be, and as decent a husband as I knew how to be, although in this department I cannot claim raging success. But the faith that common ordinary people have had in me, believing that I would be something, has helped me and given me a mission and given me a sense of commitment. I've never met a rich man that had a better mind than me. So therefore, if that's what I wanted to be, I think I could have brought it off. I don't regret being what I am, a teacher, a committed servant to a people, a writer who tried to make a connection between African people all over the world. I do not believe that there's any road for us except Pan-Africanism, a form of African traditionalism that some people refer to as socialism, a spirituality that would embrace all of us and not put us one against the other based on denominations. And a common love and respect one to the others that will go beyond political shades. I think we carry too much excess baggage in our lives. I think we need to examine our lives, and that everything in our life that failed to contribute to our freedom should be discarded as a waste of our time. I think when we begin our love affair, we should begin with ourselves. We should remember we are the only people who can make the world a promise and keep it. If we master the continent of Africa, 12 million square miles, the Caribbean islands, all the places we belong to in the Pacific, connect with all the Africans in India. We don't need to take an inch of other people's land. We need to master the art of feeding ourselves, clothing ourselves, loving ourselves. Somewhere along the line, we made the wrong turn in the road. There are 20 nations in Africa that have more than the Japanese started with. And they're not even producing a safety pin. Once we regain our self-confidence, we will regain some ability. Anything one mind did, another mind can do. Europeans have not always been in charge of the world. They're being challenged right now, and the challenge is not coming from you. And yet you, with all the resources you've got, should be making the challenge. African and African people have always been a prize to both Asians and Europeans, because we as a people have always had things that other people wanted, think they couldn't do without and didn't want to pay for. We must become the masters of ourselves and the master of everything we do or need to do for ourselves. We should never again shout nation time until we know what goes into the making of a nation. We should train and produce every single thing a nation needs, from the maker of a safety pin to the maker of a locomotive. We should get people ready to rule nations, then we should assume power, not beg for it, not petition for it. We take it. Maybe we need to go back to that fork in the road where we took the wrong turn. We need to look at the signboards again. And when we see a sign marked unity, a sign marked Pan-Africanism, a sign marked African redemption, we should know then that is the sign and that is the road that will lead us home. Thank you. I have assisted in training more than a generation of PhDs, and yet in formal education, I finished the lower part of the 7th grade. I meant my life to be some kind of a statement. I meant my life to say something. How then can a poor son of sharecroppers from Union Springs, Alabama, educate himself, give himself a high school education and a college education, and finally go to college under the GI Bill of Rights and get so bored with the teachers because he had read more than they read and got kicked out of college for contradicting the teachers because they were poor teachers of white history because he didn't expect them to teach black history at all. The point of my life is that with or without the college, I'm not advising anyone to stay out of college. Go every time the door opens if you got the fee. But I didn't have the fee. So I went to secondhand bookstores in New York where the kids sell their books after they finish. And so I got the 8th grade book, the 9th grade book, the 10th grade books. And not only studied, I gave myself an examination in each one. Then I started giving myself courses in literature. There's some things to be said about the subject that's not personal, that is broad and historical. On the face of this earth, as we look toward the 21st century, we might number 1 billion people on the face of this earth. Why is it that 1 billion people don't have the power of 1 billion people? Why is it that 1 billion people have not built an educational system and an economic system based on their numbers in the world? And we're the most strategically placed people in the world. We're scattered everywhere. Why haven't And we hooked up a network of African people from the Pacific, Asia, all over Africa, the Caribbean islands, all over South America. What separated us and what separated our mind from a belief in ourselves and a belief in the concept of nationhood? I will do what I was advised to do years ago. But years ago, working in homes in the South, I worked for whites who had good libraries, but they never seemed to use these libraries. And when I took the books home, they never seemed to miss them. So I stopped bringing them back. So I would forge the name of a well-known white person's name on a note and go to the public library where blacks were not allowed to give this boy certain books. And I would get the books until one day the person whose name I forged appeared in the library at the same time. I don't know what he was doing there. I've never seen him read a newspaper, let alone a book. So that ended my bootleg book borrowing. But my main point is that though growing up poor, unlighted streets, with a father who made $18 one week and lectured to his family, if you persevere and if you're honest, you'll make it in this country. Look what I have done. $18 in 1 week. And I listened to his lesson until years later in the Army. I took a shiner to some lady and gave a birthday party for her at a nightclub in San Antonio, Texas, and tipped the head waiter $50. Then I had to deal with my father's contradictions. I had to deal with my own contradictions. Before coming to the personal side of this whole thing, let's look at the historical side of it. We're talking about the infusion of African-American history and African history into world history and into American history. How then did we get lost from the respect for commentary of human history? We have to look at Europe, then look at Africa. I won't go back to Nile Valley civilization. That's been well covered. I want to look at that last 1,000 years of independence in West Africa before the slave trade. We have not made a serious study of what we did when the state was in our hands. We have not looked at our own humanity and how is it that on this continent we would create clusters of enduring civilizations, create religions, bring into being the concepts of the matrilineal and the patrilineal, create a system where if you had a god, you had to have a goddess, therefore giving females equality, and that man doing chores in a high school in Columbus, Georgia. I was holding the books of a recitalist. He was on stage because the high school, one of the Rosenwald high schools, the high school was so new, we didn't even have a curtain. He was performing to raise some money for the curtain. And he had a book that I was holding along with his coat. The book was called The New Negro. I opened to an essay called The Negro Digs Up His Past. By Arthur Schomburg, a Puerto Rican of African descent. I learned for the first time that I came from a people that was old, older than Europe, older than our oppressor. I began to walk around with this air of smugness. We had a civilization before these people had shoes or lived in a house that had a window. They just got here day before yesterday. I never enjoyed the unluxury of having an inferiority complex. I'm breaking up the language so you can understand what I'm talking about.